Welcome to Light Within. We are so excited you're here.
But before we dive in, we'd love to ask you for a quick favor. We're a brand new podcast, and your hitting subscribe would mean the world to us. So please take a moment to hit subscribe, like, comments, and help our team bring this amazing content to you every single week. Thank you. And now back to the episode. Dr. Newberg, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on the podcast.
I am truly, truly jealous of your job. I think you have one of the coolest jobs in the world. You're truly exploring how different components of our mind, body, and the spirit work holistically to define our well-being. And I would even go to say that, a lot of scientists tend to dismiss when it comes to topics like spirituality, but you decided to take the scientific lens and put that into spirituality. I'm really looking forward to learning everything that you have to teach us. Before we get started, I would love to just really get to know your story and how you got to who you are today.
As you mentioned in the introduction, I have spent most of my career really looking at the intersection between body, mind, and spirit, so to speak. I've been very lucky and very fortunate to be able to do the work that I do. I started out when I was very young, just asking a lot of questions about the world. The fundamental question that I had, which I still have and I'm still working on, is what is reality and how do we get to know it? I was always intrigued and continue to be, especially in today's world. If we're all looking at the same information, the same world, why don't we all have the same ideas about it? Why aren't we all the same religion, the same political party, same moral perspective on things? But we don't. Everyone has very different ideas and views. In fact, very individualized when you actually get down to it. In fact, as I like to say, if there's 8 billion people on the planet, then I think there's 8 billion religions and there's 8 billion political systems because no two people look at the world exactly the same way. I started out with the idea that from a scientific perspective, which I guess is kind of bred in my DNA a little bit, to say, well, let's try to understand how we as human beings look at the world. And so it is our brain that helps us to do that. I was eager to try to look at how the brain works and how it processes information about the world. As I pursued exploring the brain, and this was back in high school and early college years, I began to realize that while neuroscience is pretty amazing, and I still feel that way, there are certain interesting limitations that it has in terms of understanding our consciousness and certain aspects of our experiences of the world. We're kind of trapped in our own minds. We're trapped in our own consciousness. How do we get beyond that? How do you get outside of your own brain? Technically, at least from a biological perspective, you can't. But there were some interesting experiences that I had started to read about where people said that they were getting out beyond themselves and beyond their brain and beyond their consciousness. And these tended to be various spiritual experiences and mystical experiences. So I started to explore philosophical domains and theological ideas and so forth about the nature of reality and how we as human beings interact with that reality. And all of that was kind of swirling around in me when I got into medical school and started to really study the body and the brain in great detail. After my third year, I decided to, I guess what in today's lingo would be a gap year that I took. And I did this extra year where I wound up running into just 2 amazing mentors. One of them was in the world of imaging of the brain, actually imaging the body, but we focused a lot on the brain. So I started to do research looking at things like Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's and then different psychological issues, anxiety and stress and substance abuse and so forth, and was doing very traditional work. But I also met another colleague who was another mentor of mine, and he had been exploring this relationship between the brain and reality, the brain and spirituality, with very broad brushstrokes. And so we started to work together and develop some models about what was going on in the brain during different religious or spiritual practices like meditation and prayer. And eventually, a proverbial light bulb went off, and I said, oh, wait, if I'm doing brain scans of people with Alzheimer's and depression, why can't I do brain scans of people who are religious and spiritual? And that's what we started to do, and we started to study various practices, meditation, prayer, and here we are, 30 years later, still doing this kind of research and having the opportunity to be able to explore this incredible relationship and how these different practices affect us. And as all of that kind of continued, it wound wound up morphing into the field of integrative medicine, which is where I've been the last 15 years in the Department of Integrative Medicine at Thomas Jefferson University in Philadelphia, where we study the brain, we study the body, we look at the biology of who we are. But as we talk about in integrative medicine, there are really four dimensions of the person. There's the biological, psychological, social, and spiritual. And if we're going to do our best job at helping people and healing people, we need to proceed down those four different pathways to be able to help people. So that's really been the crux of my research over the last 30 years and still is. And I'm still looking for those answers to the big questions about the nature of reality. But at least I've learned some things along the way, and I'm sure we'll talk about some of that.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. And would you give us a high-level overview of the four dimensions that you just mentioned, what that entails, and especially how spirituality made it to one of the top four that you mentioned?
Certainly from a medical perspective, we focus a lot on the biology, and I think that's appropriate. In the 20th century, that was a big focus of the medical world and the development of obviously so many amazing abilities to help heal people through medications, antibiotics, psychiatric medications, pain medications, and all these different things, as well as surgical techniques. So when somebody has a problem, when somebody has depression, when somebody has Alzheimer's, when somebody has cancer, heart disease, whatever, we certainly want to focus on the biology of that. What is the issue? What's going on? How do we address that? How do we try to optimize the physiology of the body? Part of what we really focus a lot on integrative medicine is trying to do that ahead of time. Modern medicine has been reactive. You come in with a heart attack and then you take these medicines and do this and do that. Let's try to prevent it in the first place. So we focus a lot on things like diet and nutrition. We focus on making sure that people have the right nutrients in their body, the right vitamins. And so there's a lot of focus on all of that to try to optimize the biology of who we are so that we are doing our best on that front to help people stay healthy if they are and manage illnesses and diseases as effectively as possible. In the world of integrative medicine, if you have high cholesterol, for example, I'm happy to put you on a statin or some kind of medication that will help reduce your cholesterol if you need it. But I would love to be able to work with your diet and nutrition first and also make sure that your stress levels are lower and that you're exercising and that you're getting sleep and reducing inflammation in the body so that we're doing all the things possible. And then, by the way, if you happen to actually still need something even more, then, that's still part of the armamentarium of what we use to help treat people. Then there's the psychological side. And of course, there's the world of psychology and psychiatry, which is the treatment of anxiety, depression, PTSD, substance abuse, and so forth. And I think there's been, unfortunately, such a stigma applied to so many of these things. If you're depressed, people don't want to talk about it. It feels like it's a weakness of some kind. We try to elevate that to a similar kind of context of something biological. And there are biological things that are going on inside of the brain of somebody who has depression or anxiety that makes them prone to those symptoms. People aren't inherently embarrassed if they have heart disease or if they develop cancer. We try to support them through that. And I think to a certain extent, we need to think about the psychological side as well as the biological, and they're very interrelated. As I mentioned, stress, psychological stress is a huge factor in so many diseases like heart disease and cancers and things like that. So trying to work on the stress side as well as the biological side. Obviously, human beings are designed to be social creatures. We have areas of our brain that help us to communicate with each other. If you look at how we evolved from animal species who have social hierarchies and so forth that are a very important part of how they live and how they interact with each other. So having good social support is fundamental to us as human beings. When people are isolated and alone, they don't do as well. When people have good, strong social support networks, they do much better. It's radically different if you have good social support. And whether that's a spouse, family, friends, a religious community, any of those can all be part of that social support that people need. And again, it affects our biology as well. And then the fourth dimension is the spiritual dimension. If we were ordering them in terms of importance, it might be first or second, in terms of the impact that it has on people. If you look at the history of humanity, as far as I can tell, there has never been a civilization that has arisen without some type of religious or spiritual elements to it. Some of the earliest archaeological finds, even going back to 100,000 years to ancient burials where they were buried with paint on them or, with different shells or maybe an animal with them, as if there was something beyond just the purely physical. The religions of humanity have lasted far longer than any other aspect of humanity thus far. And some of the big ones have been here here for thousands of years. Clearly, the spiritual side of us is huge, and it has a very big impact on people. It has an impact on how they think about their life, of how they think about their health. And oftentimes, their sense of spirituality or religion is affected adversely when they have issues like depression or anxiety. Sometimes they feel that God is, out to get them or punishing them or something like that. So there's a lot for us to really learn and help with when it comes to the spiritual side. And of course, in my work looking at spiritual practices, we can see the physiological effects of practices like meditation and prayer, and they change the brain, they change the body, they change our immune system, they change other organs in our body. So really thinking about us along these four dimensions is so fundamental to who we are and how we try to take care of ourselves.
This can't resonate with me more because I had an episode of uncontrollable itching and it was severely affecting my sleep. At the time, I was, feeling happy, feeling fulfilled. This can't be a mental health issue. Let's go after every itching experts. I've seen like 5 to 10 different doctors. I was on, many different medications trying to control it from like very different hypotheses that were almost like a little bit adjacent to itching to see if that helps. That led to a pretty severe situation where my perception was getting dysregulated and eventually I ended up in the ER. I started to explore everything to understand what this could be. And without going into too much detail, it turned out to be from suppressed anger and anxiety that I didn't even know was present in me.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And only through like really, really deep work and using tools like prayer and EMDR was I able to recover. And now I'm truly healthier than ever. But that was a truly, truly, truly eye-opening moment to prove that the mind-body spiritual connection is real and it can affect us in a much more profound way than most people even could think of.
When we talk about what's going on in the body, especially when it comes to things like itching and reactivities and so forth, it has a lot to do with inflammation in the body and also our autonomic nervous system. So, for example, if you get like hives or something on your skin, those are blood vessels that have now been irritated, getting towards the surface, and there are different types of immune modulators, histamine, for example, leukotrienes, and so forth, all these chemicals that have to turn on the immune system. And when our body is stressed, when our immune system is stressed, when our autonomic nervous system is stressed, then these can turn on. What's interesting, and we talk about this a lot in integrative medicine, is that a lot of times there's sort of like a thresholding thing. There may be something that you were allergic to quote unquote allergic to, that when your immune system and everything is operating fine, it's not an issue. It's just kind of this low level thing that your body doesn't bother with it. But when, the stressors come to the surface, when other aspects come to the surface, now suddenly goes above a threshold and boom, you have all these symptoms or these issues. So we see that a lot. You think things like fatigue. We all get tired if we run for, 5 miles, or if we're very active or we have a busy day at work or whatever, we feel tired, and that's part of the natural process of it. But we have the ability to kind of rejuvenate our energies. We sleep, we keep ourselves below a threshold. But for some people, between everything that they're doing, then they have stressors, so they're not sleeping as well. And then maybe, they get a viral illness, or they're not eating well and their gut is inflamed. All these things start to ratchet up until you finally get above a threshold. These are the people who can wind up with things like chronic fatigue syndrome or chronic pain syndromes. Part of the goal of helping to manage them is to focus on all the different elements. In fact, we're trained in medicine to find the one thing. But with a lot of these complex issues, it often is very multifactorial. We need to think about on multiple levels. Sometimes the stress is just too much. Maybe you have a moderate level of stress all the time, but now you have a virus, you have a cold, and you're not feeling that well. Well, now the stress level that was moderate feels more severe because you're not able to think as clearly. You couldn't do your work on time. Your mood isn't great. You get to these kind of thresholding issues where it can kind of kick the whole system out of whack. And sometimes this leads to very long-term consequences for people. So this is what we try to manage in integrative medicine, but I think ultimately what we need to manage in the world of medical care.
That is so interesting because even at a biological level, there's a concept of homeostasis, our machine kind of keeping everything in balance. It's a pretty delicate balance.
Absolutely.
But even at a organism level, as a human being, we're still in homeostasis with, stressors, situations. our environment, everything that's going on, and it's important to pay attention to all of that. And so people who might be struggling with chronic pain, even chronic mental health issues, it actually might not be just that isolated problem. It might actually be, you might have to, let's say, focus on your social relationship. You might have to focus on spirituality, really look at things holistically.
We see so many people who will come in and they have headaches and they feel tired. In the back of our mind, we're like, this person needs to get out of their job. They're not looking at their job, but because you could kind of tell as they were talking about it that this is where all their stressors are coming from. People have to really do a good job of taking stock in where they are and what are the things that are bothering them, because these things can manifest in so many different ways that they can feel physical, and they can even be measured physiologically. I mean, we know if you're under stress, your heart rate goes up and your blood pressure goes up, and there's more cortisol, the stress hormone, that's circulating in your system. Well, if there's more cortisol, we take cortisol and medicines like prednisone to reduce our immune system function. Sometimes we need to do that if somebody has like an autoimmune disease. But when it's reactive, because it's reacting to all this stress, then your immune system goes down when it's not supposed to go down. And so now you're prone to infections, you're prone to cancers and other types of issues. We have this homeostasis, this balance. And, on one hand, it feels tenuous. On the other hand, I mean, the body is quite remarkable in being able to maintain that balance and to do that over long periods of time. But I think it's important for everybody to look at themselves and where that homeostasis is. We wrote a book called Brainweaver, and we try to get people to look at, is there the sum total of themselves, the sum total of their lives. We all have strengths, we all have weaknesses. Part of the goal is how do you kind of utilize your strengths effectively, and how do you minimize the weaknesses? For example, you tend to feel tired a little bit more than most people. Well, making sure you get a good enough sleep, making sure that you're eating well in such a way that maintains your energy levels throughout the day. There's things that you can do to mitigate that issue that could potentially cause more of a problem. So there's some people who handle stressors well. Other people don't handle stressors as well. When you talk about people who don't handle stress as well, some people, when they don't handle it well, they get a headache. Other people get a stomach ache. Other people feel all angry inside. All of that's part of what people need to understand and take into consideration. Where are my strengths? Where are my weaknesses? And then try to find ways of effectively utilizing those strengths and minimizing the weaknesses, or helping to develop around those weaknesses.
I think what you're describing is so powerful, is this concept of like individualized kind of differences in what we need, especially based on our circumstances. And I do remember I was constantly tired, like falling asleep everywhere, very dependent on caffeine. And I was getting like 7 hours of sleep. And I was like, I'm getting enough sleep. Why am I such way? And then once I just simply increased that to 8 hours, all of those went away. And I didn't know that most of my life. Most of my life, I just thought I just fall asleep. That's just who I am. I'm just tired.
You brought up another really important part of integrative medicine, but of all these things that we're talking about, which is the individualized aspect of it. There's no inherent right or wrong for a given person. Some people do great on 7 hours of sleep. Some people need 8. Some people need 9. Some people need to have more caffeine. Some people need to have less caffeine. Some people can exercise, 2 hours a day. Some people only can exercise 10 minutes a day. Part of what we always need to try to do is understand where each person is. Have each person, again, kind of take some stock in terms of who they are, how they operate, how they work, and then how to kind of optimize those different processes, and making sure that you have the right amount of sleep for you. And how do you try to get that effectively? Can you do it naturally? Do you need to do some kind of meditation? Maybe you need to take a supplement. Sometimes you need to take a medication. People should try to develop their homeostasis as naturally as possible, but also shouldn't be completely avoidant of some of the wonderful medications that we have that be extremely valuable to you. Like an interesting example, you mentioned earlier on that I've done some studies on meditation practices. Meditation is involved in concentration. So people have thought about using meditation to help people with cognitive issues, or maybe even things like attention deficit disorder. And that is absolutely the case, that if you meditate and you use that as a tool, it's like doing exercise for your brain. And actually, there's evidence to show that if you meditate, your frontal lobes become bigger, they function better. And we know that that's one of the areas that's affected in things like attention deficit disorder. But if the attention deficit disorder is so problematic that you can't meditate to begin with, then you got to start with the medications to help you to concentrate enough that you can start to meditate. Then as you start to meditate, maybe you can come off the medications or reduce. There's always this kind of interesting individualized process that I think people need to think about, which is that there isn't a one size fits all and there's no one way that absolutely one should do it. We should always use evidence as best as we can. But one of the biggest problems that we often talk about is you'll have a study that showed that, well, if you give 500 people a drug for attention deficit disorder, on average, they get 20% better. Well, that's great, but that means that some people only, didn't get better at all, and other people got better 50% or something like that. So again, trying to appreciate and explore that and understand that. I always feel that whatever people decide to try, they should understand why they're doing it. There should be a reason for it, whether this is a natural product. A menopausal woman says, I heard this is good because it helps with osteoporosis. You have it, do you have osteoporosis in the first place? If you do, great. If you think that that might be helpful and there's some evidence to support that it works, then you want to evaluate it. You want to see, maybe it helps you with the symptom. Maybe it's helping you with hot flashes. Maybe it's helping you with osteoporosis. And there are measures of that, either how you feel physically, or is there some objective measure, a laboratory study? If you think that you're going to take this supplement, it's going to reduce your cholesterol, then did it. And if it didn't, stop taking it. And this is also why, people ideally can look into these things, but work with their physicians to help them figure out what is working, what isn't working. Just because something lowers your blood pressure or lowers your cholesterol, did it do it enough? Is it getting you to the goals that we have some understanding of in terms of what are the most effective ways of managing our bodies and making sure that they stay healthy? That individualization piece is very, very important.
You're truly at the forefront of this next wave of our understanding of health and wellness, and even where medicine is headed. I do think there's so much value in going more specific, right, on one thing, which is where medicine, I believe, mostly gravitated towards. But now you're zooming out. You're looking at the whole system holistically. Hope that a lot of our listeners can start to do so as well. Look at themselves as unique individuals. When it comes to someone's mental health and well-being, which dimension would you say is the most often overlooked?
Sometimes in the world of psychology or psychiatry, one of the most often overlooked issues is the biological side. In the world of psychiatry, it's one of the only specialties of medicine that does not routinely image the organ that it takes care of. If you have a heart problem, you get an echocardiogram. If you hurt your elbow, you get an x-ray of your elbow. People come in with depression, nobody looks at your brain. Part of what we've been trying to do and what I hope is a future direction to go is how can we look at the structure of the brain, the function of the brain, to help us understand some of the underlying issues that come about when people have different psychological issues like depression or anxiety. I don't think everybody with depression is the same, and clearly they're not, because when people are given antidepressants, they can work very well, but they don't work well for everybody. And so why not? Well, because it's not the same thing. And maybe if we found out that they work really well when people with depression have, a low frontal lobe activity, then maybe we should check to see a person's frontal lobe activity first, decide which kind of medication. Now, unfortunately, this is research and data that we're still looking for and still trying to develop. But I think that to me is actually a very important piece. And we have done a lot of work with brain scans in people who have different chronic issues, like cognitive issues or anxiety or depression. We've done a lot of studies, for example, in people with concussions who have persistent symptoms, chronic fatigue, and so forth. They often break down and cry when we show them their brain scan is not normal. I think the biological part is certainly fundamental and something that we need to learn more about and explore. And then I think the other piece is the spiritual piece, which is that I think so often people really ignore that. In the world of psychiatry, it goes way back to Freud and kind of this disdain for the religious. But when we look around, we see so many people hold religious and spiritual beliefs that are important to them. When people are dealing with stress, when they're dealing with anxiety, when they're dealing with depression, PTSD, substance abuse, and so forth, having an ability to turn towards something which is spiritual often can be a very powerful source of healing and recovery for people, particularly in the world of substance abuse. Groups like Alcoholics Anonymous, approaches like that evoke a higher power. very, very fundamental and very important for that. Now, again, never a one size fits all. And you wouldn't tell somebody who is a very staunch atheist to start praying to God because there's some evidence to show that it helps to improve anxiety. But I think people who have a history of religious and spiritual beliefs that were important to them, to be able to help them to find their path back to that, to be able to use that approach as an additional source for helping them into their recovery, in addition to traditional psychotherapeutic interventions, in addition to medications when needed, can be a very, very important and very powerful thing that people need to do. Even sort of lift it to a meta level, which is that another place where we've just sort of missed an opportunity is to go to houses of worship, the churches, the synagogues, the mosques, and get the people, the clergy in those places, those houses of worship, to recognize the importance of mental health, to help people to explore their mental health, to set up mental health clinics to help people when they actually do have depression or anxiety. These congregations can be incredibly valuable to people to help them through mental health issues. And I think there's a great opportunity there for places of worship to be able to help people feel better about having mental health issues, and also screening for them and also helping them to heal them. The clergy and so forth, they should be hopefully connected to people in the psychological world in their respective towns, and vice versa. If a person is going to a psychologist and they're dealing with depression or PTSD, I think an important question should be, do you have any religious beliefs that are important to you that should be part of this process? And even if the psychologist or the psychiatrist isn't comfortable talking about that, to know to refer them back to somebody in pastoral care, somebody who is a clergy, going back to their church, synagogue, whatever, I think becomes very, very important for being able to help people. So I think those are the two real areas the psychological piece sometimes misses.
Yeah, I cannot agree with that more. And I do actually feel like there has been a movement of, let's say, church communities encouraging exploration of mental health more, seeking professional support. Maybe back in the day, from the church's perspective, like your spirituality not being strong enough, but also just now recognizing that, your spirituality is so important, but also there's that mental and physical piece that hopefully the church can and other religious communities can encourage. So thank you for sharing that.
A lot of my research, especially in the realm of spirituality and the brain, a field is often referred to as neurotheology. We do talk a lot about the physiological effects of these practices, but to emphasize what you just were talking about, there is definitely a very big need for exploring the negative side of religion and spirituality. And by that, I mean, what happens when it doesn't work well for people? What happens when people feel that God is punishing them? What happens when people feel that, they got their cancer or whatever because they weren't religious enough? And then there's even more problematic issues when people decide to join cults, or when people engage in really horrific behaviors like killing people and so forth in the name of God. How can we look at all of this? How can we look at this quote unquote negative side of religion and spirituality to try to help them, to redirect them into the more positive? And this is something that I've talked about in a lot of my books, the value of compassion, that, a practice like prayer is extremely valuable, but only if the prayer practice is about love, compassion, reducing your stress levels and so forth, embracing love, embracing the world, embracing humanity. If your prayer practice is about I'm right and everybody else is wrong, or I hate people who don't believe the way I do, then that actually just increases your stress and increases all the problems that we've been talking about, and sometimes leads people to behaviors that are ultimately very destructive, either for their own self or for the community around them. This whole field of work, this neurotheology, I think has a great opportunity to help us on a very pragmatic level, a very practical level, to help us understand where religious and spiritual beliefs go well and how they can be helpful, and also what happens when they don't go well and how we hopefully can try to find ways of avoiding that.
And you mentioned two different populations. One is either religious or they were religious and are open to it. The second is people who are not religious. I'd love to discuss both populations and how you recommend approaching spirituality. For religious or people who are open to religion, what kind of evidence is out there that proves the positive impact of religion? How do you even prove that? How do you even study that?
I wrote a book called Principles of Neurotheology, and in there I talk a lot about methodological challenges. The simple answer to your question is there are a great deal of studies that have been done that have looked at religious measures. Sometimes it's how often people go to church or some kind of house of worship. Makes sense. Arguably speaking, if somebody goes to church every week, they're probably more religious than somebody who goes once a year. Not perfect, but not bad. Certainly within reason. It might be difficult to differentiate a person who goes once a week versus once every 2 weeks, but certainly once a week versus once a year versus people who don't go at all. When people have done studies looking at outcomes for people who participate in religious groups, there's a lot of evidence to show that they tend to do on average better. These are population-based studies. They take 5,000 people who are religious and 5,000 people who aren't, and the 5,000 people who are religious tend to do a little bit better in terms of the risk for heart disease and stroke. Now, there's a lot of interesting issues with that. So part of the question is, what does that actually mean, again, on an individual level? Well, not as much. There are plenty of religious people who die young, and there's plenty of atheists who die at 100 because there are other dimensions of who we are, as we've been talking about. So there's a lot of different factors that go into that. The other issue that we also need to think about is that, let's say we acknowledge that there is this value, there's a reduction of 10% or whatever the numbers are in terms of mortality or in terms of risk of cancer. Then the question is, well, why? What's going on? What are the active ingredients, so to speak? It gets a little bit back to this issue of the different dimensions of who we are. So, for example, when you go to a house of worship, there's a social support network there. So now, is that the spiritual side of things, or is it the social side of things that it helps to benefit us? It may be a little bit of both, but it certainly has that social element of it, which can be very important. And when somebody develops cancer and they have a congregation that comes to the hospital and brings them food, it helps to just reduce all of the issues and stressors that they're already dealing with. Then the person's going to do better, and they're going to be more optimistic, and they're probably going to have a better outcome in the end. There's the social benefit of that. There are the practices, as we've kind of talked about a little bit. I've done a lot of brain scan studies of practices like meditation and prayer, and show changes in areas like the frontal lobes and our limbic system, the emotional centers of our brain, when you do these practices. So if somebody's in the hospital and they're sitting there meditating or praying or something like that, it's reducing their stress, it's reducing their heart rate, which now means that their immune system is working a little bit better and their heart is working a little bit better. So they're going to probably recover a little bit better. Maybe they'll tolerate the effects of chemotherapy better, so they can have higher doses, and that means that it works better. So again, it's not inherently because of the religious or spiritual, but I refer to these a lot as indirect mechanisms. The social impact. Another really good one is dietary. There's traditions like the Hindu tradition, where if you're really a believer in Hinduism, you may be a vegetarian. And in our world of integrative medicine, we encourage everybody to have a more plant-based diet. So if you're a vegetarian because you're Hindu and you do well from a health perspective, is that because you're a Hindu, or because your Hindu faith is asking you to be a vegetarian, which actually has a benefit? Now, are there primary effects? That's where I sometimes come back to the practices like prayer, that there seems to be a direct effect on people for doing something which is religious or spiritual. We often talk about things like ontological anxiety. Does religion sort of just help us to feel like God is on our side, the world is a good place, I'm optimistic about the future? And studies have shown that when people have a more positive outlook, when people have higher levels, for example, of dispositional optimism, they do better. Those elements that are kind of inherent in what it means to be religious can actually have a very positive effect for people. There's a lot of examples, there's a lot of data out there, a lot of studies that have been done over the last 20, 30 years that show that overall, that being religious or spiritual tends to confer health benefits for people. It goes back to why I often say that if you do have a religious or spiritual tradition which has value to you, then to continue to try to pursue that, or maybe even augment that as part of your overall care of who you are as a human being.
Again, spirituality is such a elusive concept for many, but for people who are spiritual, there is so much truth to the practice itself. There's a kind of whole new level of truth for science to be able to unearth some of the effects of that. But of course, there's a lot of challenges that you mentioned with confounding variables and other cultural, social impact. Potentially the positive impact of religion could outweigh the negative impact on a population level, which is very interesting.
I'll throw in one other little interesting twist, which is it actually even has a relationship with the overall political system that a person
Mm,
lives within.
yeah.
In the United States, religion in general is very well tolerated and encouraged in many ways. And if you're religious, you do pretty good. But if you now go to a communist country where religion is really looked down upon, Karl Marx talked about it being the opiate of the masses, and they don't want religion. Well, if you are a religious individual associated with a great deal of stress and anxiety, it can kind of cut both ways. It's not just because somebody is religious, but also within the cultural and political milieu in which they live.
For people who are not necessarily religious or are not interested in exploring, can they also approach spirituality in a different way?
Absolutely. I talk about this in a number of my books, how God changes your brain, how enlightenment changes your brain. There often can be a religious basis for engaging the world, and that can be very valuable for people. There are so many people who have a kind of spiritual side, I'll call it the spiritual side of who they are. And I don't even inherently mean a supernatural side, but a side that just makes us feel that we're connected to something greater than just ourselves. And that can be achieved through all kinds of approaches. So it can be achieved through art, music, literature. The most common one is being in nature, taking a hike, taking a walk. There's so many different ways in which people can engage that spiritual side of themselves. For people who are atheists but often consider themselves to be humanists, go out and help people. Go out and help to take care of people who are homeless, who have issues with mental health or physical health. Volunteer for, at a hospital, or help to take care of kids or teach or something like that. There are a lot of different ways that we can start to feel more connected to our world, more connected to the rest of humanity, more connected to the universe. That can be wonderful ways of people who don't necessarily have a belief in God or something supernatural, but help them to feel a greater sense of connectedness to the world. And of course, practices like meditation, there's many different approaches nowadays that have been secularized, like mindfulness, yoga practices. Yoga derives from the Hindu tradition and is a deeply spiritual practice based on Hinduism. But most of the people who go to their local yoga studio, they're not going there to become Hindus or become enlightened. They're going there to stretch and to relax, which is great. And that's all part of it. There are many different ways that people can engage that other side of themselves, that spiritual side of themselves, without necessarily having any belief in God or something supernatural. It goes back to one of the points I made earlier, which is people have to kind of take stock in who they are and what they feel strongly about, what they can do. One other little tidbit for the people who are listening is that whatever one does, part of what some of our research studies have shown is that it only works as well as you kind of make it work. Meaning that if you're doing a prayer practice because you really believe in it and it's a part of you and it's important to you and it has meaning to you, then it's going to really have a big impact on you. If you're just saying a prayer because you read some study that said that, hey, you should do this prayer practice because maybe it'll help your anxiety, it's not going to work all that well. And we've shown this when people are fully engaged versus just provisionally engaged, that when you're fully engaged, it has a much more profound effect on the brain. It's like doing a practice like yoga. If you go to your yoga studio and you do the stretches and you do a little meditation, yeah, you're going to lower your heart rate. You're going to improve your immune system and stress levels and things like that. And that's great. It's going to take you here. Whereas if you're a Hindu and you are doing these yoga practices as part of a lifelong pursuit of enlightenment, it's going to do all kinds of things for you. That is an important part of it. Whatever somebody does, they believe in it, that it has meaning to them, it's important to them, and they feel they can fully engage that. And that to me is actually a really important take-home message.
When we first started Aura, and mindfulness is a very much core component of what the type of content and modality that we have. We actually made sure that the first creators were not spiritual, but really approaching mindfulness from more of a secular perspective so that people who don't necessarily, let's say, even believe in God can experience spirituality, can experience the power of meditation and healing from really just a mind practice in some sense. It is so interesting, so powerful to think that just simply being able to control your mind on something you want to, just a simple practice like that in the simplest manner could have such a profound impact.
In a lot of our own research, when we've kind of scoured the literature for other research, I think another important take-home message for people is that there are thousands of different ways of doing it. It is individualized. People have to come up with what works best for them. Some of the research has shown that just focusing on your breathing for 30 seconds, for 60 seconds will reduce your stress. And so if you're about to go into a big meeting or deal with some very stressful situation, just taking a few deep breaths for a minute can be helpful. People have to realize again that there are so many different ways of doing these kinds of practices that they can have an impact on a lot of different levels. And it is important for people to think about what their goals are, what they're striving to achieve, and whether or not the practices that they're doing are helping them towards those paths. That's actually a very important thing that I tell a lot of our patients over the years and talk about in my more public work, which is that if you're exploring a particular practice, if you want to start a practice like meditation, what should you do? Well, part of it is, who are you? What works for you? What do you like to do? Are you okay with just sitting still for an a half hour? Do you have to be moving? How do you feel in your body? Do you have pain? Do you have things that create problems for you if you're supposed to do a yoga program or whatever? Who are you in terms of what are your kind of strengths and weaknesses? What are your goals? Are you looking to de-stress? Are you looking to reduce depression? Are you looking for something more profound, spiritual, metaphysical? And then try to pull all of that together to try to figure out the best way of creating a program that will work best for you. And I encourage people to talk to local teachers. If you're going to do a mindfulness program, talk to that teacher. Do you like them? Are they talking to you in a way that makes sense to you, that you can understand and you feel comfortable with? There is ultimately a little bit of trial and error, and you do have to kind of try something, give it a decent try for 2 months, 3 months or whatever. But if after 2 or 3 months it's not working, it's creating anxiety, it's making you miserable, it's probably not right for you. If on the other hand, it feels good and it feels great and you're progressing and all that, then it probably is a great system for you. So it's just a matter of figuring out what works best for each person. And people can do more than one, obviously, but ultimately kind of putting together a program that's going to work best for them.
When we discuss topics like spirituality, one thing that comes to my mind is the term surrender. And myself as a Christian, many other, both religious and non-religious people seem to really see the power of surrendering. What does surrender mean, and what does that actually look like?
That's a great question, and something that I was fortunate to be able to really explore in some detail, and how enlightenment changes your brain. First of all, started out with a survey of people who had very intense spiritual experiences, and we asked them to describe those experiences. Everybody's experience was completely unique, but we were also able to take the different words that people used and find different categories, different components of these experiences that seem to be universal. One of them was a feeling of surrender. There were others, like a feeling of unity or oneness, but that feeling of surrender seems to be a very fundamental part of so many of these experiences. What people usually mean by that is a couple of things. One is they're not making it happen. When you start to do a prayer practice or a meditation, you're focusing on it, you're doing it. But at some point, it kind of takes over and you feel like you're kind of along for the ride. So that's part of it, that you no longer feel like you're making it happen. So part of it is you're no longer pushing, but then the other part of it is that there's a kind of pull. It is literally kind of taking you along for a ride. I often think about like sneezing, like up to a point you can kind of control it, but there's nothing you can do and it's going to happen. There's a couple of different things like that in our physiology. One of them, it seems to be these kinds of very intense experiences where people feel this sense of surrender, release, letting go. People have different terms that they use. In terms of the brain itself, what we have observed when we have looked at practices that are particularly associated with a feeling of surrender is a very interesting change that occurs in the frontal lobe. So the frontal lobe, located behind our forehead, normally turns on when we are focusing our attention, when we're doing something purposeful. So if you were to start a meditation practice and you're focusing on a mantra, on an image, on God, whatever, you start by activating your frontal lobe, and you're concentrating. Your frontal lobe turns on if you're trying to solve a math problem too. But that at some point, what we have observed is that frontal lobe, that heightened frontal lobe activity drops away. And when the frontal lobe decreases, that is associated with the feeling of surrender. And that makes sense to me because physiologically and psychologically, when you are purposely doing something, your frontal lobe is on. But when your frontal lobe shuts down, you are no longer purposely doing it. So it feels like it's not something that you're doing, it's something that is happening to you. And that's exactly what we see in these very profound experiences, both in terms of how people describe it, but also in terms of what we see physiologically.
And What are some surprising findings about like the concept of surrender? What are some kind of outcomes?
Part of the thing that I think is very important is there's this kind of dynamic change. All of this stuff we're talking about is dynamic. Your cholesterol level, your blood pressure, your brain function, they're always changing. Everything's moving around. For your listeners who do meditation or prayer, what your brain is doing in the first minute is different than what it's doing after 5 minutes, after 20 minutes, after an hour, after 4 hours, after days if you go on like a retreat. So your brain is constantly doing different things as you go through this process. In addition to this idea of focusing attention, what do your frontal lobes do for you in general? Well, they actually do what are called executive functions. And what that means is it kind of controls and regulates and kind of establishes sort of your whole life, where each thing goes. I often think about it as like it's like the filing cabinet of your brain. So it makes sure that, okay, this is my work folder, and when I go to work, I take my work folder out, I do my work, and then I put my folder back, and then I go home and I got to take the kids out to the soccer, and you got all these different folders in there, and your frontal lobe keeps them all under control, and it's got the whole filing system all set up so that you know what to do when you need to do it. When the frontal lobe decreases, it's kind of like all of a sudden all those folders got thrown up in the air. When you finally kind of come back from that experience, you're trying to put them all back. But basically what I think it does is it kind of provides an opportunity for people to really let go, not only in the moment, but let go their life, so to speak, let go of all the things, of all these different things that were slotted into these different folders, into these different filing cabinets. So it gives you an opportunity to kind of rearrange your lifestyle and rearrange the way you think about things. And talking about the effects of these spiritual experiences in the surveys that we did, one of the key elements of these experiences is something that's transformational. It changes us. About 95% of the time, it changes us for the better. And that is across many domains. People feel that they have improvements in their health, in their both mental and physical. They have improvements in their relationships, in the way they look at their job, improvements in the way they look at the world spiritually or religiously. So I think that's kind of what's happening. It's a very powerful effect of this letting go, which again also has a potentially profound effect for a variety of different mental health issues like depression, like anxiety, like substance abuse, like PTSD. People keep kind of like holding on to this way of being and this way of thinking. And then you have this incredible sense of release that allows you to no longer have to feel that additional angst of how you're trying to control everything. And it kind of allows your own essence to come through and to kind of engage the world in a new way. And I think that becomes a very important part of the healing process for so many people. It's the proverbial hitting rock bottom, I think, for a lot of people, that when they hit that rock bottom, it's like everything goes away. And now I've got to sort of put my life back together, but I'm going to do it in a different way.
Wow, that is so powerful. That is truly kind of proving that you don't have to be stuck in one way. Like transformation is possible. No matter who you are, whatever age you are, you can change and build a totally different life. There's like a collection of small, let's say, emotional traumas, things that happen to us that make us build these structures to stay safe. But at some point, it gets either too much or it no longer serves you. And you kind of have to break away from that and kind of start with this fresh eye of a newborn almost. I've definitely had many experiences, transformative experiences, one being the episode from last year and having to really confront all of my kind of not just stress and anxiety, but all my triggers, all my, let's say, relationship challenges, learning to confront that, process that, and spend a lot of time on it. Now I spend actually every single day as part of my practice now to think about relationships and where am I getting stuck? Where do I feel so much friction or fear, let's say? And overcoming that over time has been transformational in myself, being able to just show up as a better person to my partner, to my company as a leader. That's a really powerful encouragement for people to take the next step.
When we looked at this survey of 2,000 people who had these different kinds of experiences, everyone can have these experiences. You don't have to be a monk. You don't have to be some profoundly religious individual. It can happen to everyone. It can happen to anyone. The exact way it happens often is very unique and different. And unfortunately, there's no way where we can just, touch you on the forehead and boom, you have that enlightenment experience. But if people strive for it and look for it, the good news is that it seems to be out there for everyone. It is a matter of finding the right combination to the lock. But if you find the right combination, it can be a wonderful experience and can be really transformative for a person's lifetime.
I would also love to touch on the importance of social connections. I feel like many of us kind of like conceptually know relationships and social connections are important, but you actually shared that there's a profound impact on your health and well-being. Curious to learn more
Right.
about that.
Certainly, we have parts of our brain that help us to feel connected to others. There's areas, kind of interesting names like the precuneus and the insula, which help us to perceive the emotional responses in other people, that help us to see what our social hierarchies and how we interact, what our relationships are with other people. Of course, we have language, which is the ability to communicate with others and to express our ideas and our thoughts and our feelings to each other on many different kinds of levels. And I mean, interestingly, a lot of the early work that I had done was with regard to the concept of rituals. And I mentioned at the beginning of the program, one of my mentors in the field of studying religion and spirituality. Well, his entree into that was that not only was he a psychiatrist, but he had a PhD in anthropology, and he looked at rituals and how rituals affected us as human beings and what do they do for us as human beings. And what rituals do through a variety of sensory processes and ultimately rhythmic processes is break down in our brain the self other dichotomy. There's an area of our brain, the parietal lobe, which we have shown decreases when people are engaged in these rituals. And this is an area that kind of creates our sense of self. So when it shuts down, we lose that sense of self. Sometimes people truly lose their sense of self, but what that really means is that it's not just me, it's me as a group. It's me as this congregation. It's me as this country. It's me as humanity. It's me as the universe. This sense of feeling connected to something greater is part of that social interaction that occurs, and the process of rituals becomes very, very important to that. The most recent book I published was called Sex God and the Brain. And in fact, the one other interesting little twist to all of this is that, he often talked about, if you take an evolutionary perspective for a moment, that if we have human rituals, well, they evolved from animal rituals. And so he's like, well, do animals have rituals? Well, yeah, the animal world is loaded with rituals, but interestingly, all animal rituals are mating rituals. But what is a mating ritual? It's breaking down the self other so that you can come together to mate. So the idea that that biological process that is so fundamental in basically every animal on the planet, including us as human beings, really is part of how our biology connects us to each other, connects us to our world, connects us to God, connects us to the universe. There's this whole interweaving of our sexuality, our spirituality, and ultimately the social elements of who we are. But they really are fundamental to our being, the ability to have that connection with other people. It's fundamental to who we are. It was necessary for us as human beings to survive. Other than a few very unusual examples, we can't live without each other. Perhaps why we're all here to help each other out.
I think what you're describing is that the social connections have an impact that's like even greater than just that one-to-one relationship. Also what they do, how they live, how you live and act collectively, all of that can shape who you are as well.
Right. Another book that we published called Why We Believe What We Believe. Social influences were one of the cornerstones of where our beliefs come from. And of course they are. I mean, where do our beliefs come from? Well, it starts socially through our parents. The moment we are born, we are taught what language to speak. We are taken to a specific church or house of worship or whatever. We're told what is good and what is bad and what is right and what is wrong and how to talk to people and how not to talk to people. So, the social influences of our parents on us is massive. And then, of course, as we grow up and we have our friends and our teachers, the larger world around us, the other inspirational people in the world, hopefully some of the political leaders and religious and spiritual leaders and so forth, scientific leaders, these are the people whose ideas we come across and who radically transform how we decide to be as individuals. So the social influence on our beliefs and on who we are as people is beyond profound. I mean, it is essential for us to develop any of our beliefs. Now, again, I mean, part of the problem is sometimes things don't go well, and we're taught that if you have a mental health problem, that's not such a good thing. It's a weakness. The big problem nowadays with social media, we see this with kids and adolescents, and they look on these different platforms and they see people having a good time, and they're like, well, how come I'm not having a good time? And I try to remind them that they took like 3,000 pictures and they showed the one picture where they're having a great time or whatever. No one's life is perfect. And even with the social media platforms, I mean, conceptually they can be wonderful. They can really create groups and help bring people together. But as with other circumstances, if they go off the rails, as they unfortunately often do, they can lead to a great deal of stress and anxiety. And that is one of the big issues right now with the current generation, the younger generation, which is a lot of stress and anxiety because of all of this fear of missing out and what are other people doing, and this person looks better than I do and they have the right clothes and I don't. Back when I was growing up, if I didn't go to a party, I didn't even know what happened. Nowadays, if you don't go to a party, you see 4,000 pictures of everybody having a great time at the party that you weren't at. There's sort of pros and cons to all these things. It's a matter of navigating them as effectively as possible.
For people who may feel like their relationships are not as strong, or let's say they're not as happy with it, what are some actions that they could take?
Going back to one of the earlier points I made, I mean, it's always a matter of taking stock on who you are. What kind of person are you? What do you like? I mean, this may be the obvious, but if you like sports, then join a sports club. If you like chess, join a chess club. If you like art, go to art museums. Part of it is trying to engage people who share common aspects of life with you. Of course, it's also good to challenge yourself. Part of it is putting yourself out there as best as possible, being cautious and protecting yourself. There's a balance there between being overly cautious and overly out there. I think everybody can kind of find people who they resonate with. And this is an interesting issue of brain research too, which is that when we are communicating with each other and communicating effectively, we resonate with each other. Another book, Words Can Change Your Brain, we talk a lot about compassionate communication and the ability to how we communicate with each other, to engage with people in a way where you kind of do deep listening, a bit of a meditative process to take some deep breaths, to listen to what somebody's saying, to respond in an effective way, in a brief way, and help them to sort of see what you are as a person, to try to understand who they are as a person, and see if you ultimately go off in a similar direction or if you're going off in different directions. But I think it's important for people to try to be together. I think especially in this world of political divisiveness, we need to listen to each other and we need to try to do our best. And I know it's hard, but I think it's always important to try to listen to what other people have to say, to challenge your own ideas and beliefs. But again, within reason. If you were the only Democrat in a room full of 30 staunch Republicans, it's probably not going to go all that well for you, and vice versa. It's going to be very stressful and upsetting. Finding how to engage people from other perspectives, other religions, other political ideologies is very helpful. Finding ways of doing that can be very useful for people in terms of just growth, but also in terms of trying to foster spiritual and other social connections. Again, if you do happen to have some specific spiritual leanings through a church group, mosque, synagogue, those kinds of groups, those congregations can also be helpful places to go in terms of fostering more social interactions with people.
Yeah, relationships are, as you said, just definitely not easy. There's a lot of things we have to learn to develop good, healthy, strong relationships, but they're truly worth fighting for and putting yourself out there for. So thank you for sharing that.
No question.
I'm really curious, Dr. Newman, about your personal either well-being practices or habits that you've developed for yourself from your research.
I do a kind of personal meditation. As I mentioned at the very beginning, a lot of this is my own exploration of reality. A part of that process became a very contemplative process. So I do my own form of meditation. I don't do a specific kind of meditation, but I do my own form that is very helpful and very valuable to me. Going back to our discussion about the different dimensions, I love physical activity, and so exercise on a daily basis at pretty high levels is always pretty important to me. And I like doing lots of different things. So it's great, one day to take a walk, another day to take a hike in the mountains, another day to play pickleball, another day to, play tennis or soccer or whatever. So it's great to do lots of different things. For me, I try to eat carefully, enjoy my food. Unfortunately, I have a huge sweet tooth, but I try to work with that as best as possible and keep my stress levels as best as possible. Try to have a good social life and be socially connected with my family, with my friends. And then my own intellectual life is the combination of this kind of spiritual and scientific path of neurotheology. And, I just have a passion for exploring that. And I love getting lost and surrendering into that whole process and finding where that journey takes me. So those are the things that I typically try to do.
You mentioned two really important words, pickleball and soccer. I love to play
I love both of them.
And I think you bring up a very, very important concept, which is it's so important to love what you do and to find, a lot of curiosity, a lot of even spiritual connection from your work. Is there a way that maybe other people, maybe even if they don't necessarily actually love their job, maybe can find that sense of purpose from their work?
It is challenging at times. I wish everyone is able to find, something that they are passionate about. I think most people know, all work gets boring, doing the same thing day in and day out. But if it's something that you find interesting and fun, then it's great. Part of the basis for doing whatever you do is that it's something that has value to you, that you feel you're making a contribution, that you're helping the world, that you enjoy, you find, stimulating and interesting. And beyond that, looking for other sources that can augment that. So, if your job itself may not be the most interesting, then make sure you're reading and make sure you're studying and make sure you're learning a new language or, whatever. There's so many things out there in today's world. Use social media to learn, to explore the world and to challenge yourself. So I think that's the best way to do it. It is wonderful when people can find a vocation that has meaning to them. I was involved in a book that was on the concept of callings. It is certainly wonderful if you can feel called and if you can feel that something that gives you meaning and purpose in your life. I certainly encourage people to, again, take stock in who they are, take stock in what they like to do, and try to find that within their own jobs. And if not, at least try to explore other ways of bringing that into their lives from the different things that they do and the hobbies that they do.
Dr. Newman, what would be the one thing that you would love to recommend to our listeners to help them find the light within themselves?
The basis of life to me is asking questions. I just encourage everyone to ask questions, and whether those are asking questions about your job, your relationships, your life, the things that you want to learn about. Life is about exploring and trying to learn and find things out. I think if people are always looking at questions, then they don't always feel the pressure to find the answers. To me, always being on a journey somewhere is a very rewarding process. I've certainly learned so much from doing that, but I think it's great to be able to just continue to push yourself to learn, to grow, to develop, to explore, and ultimately that comes from asking questions. And I think when you ask all those questions, that opens up those holes from which the light comes in. That's what it's all about.
Where can people find more about you and also find your incredible books?
My books are on most of the online retailers. People can always go to my website, which is just Andrew Newberg, NEWBERG.com. They can also follow me on Instagram at Dr. Andrew Newberg. I'm actually trying to take people through my own personal journey as part of that process, so they can help me explore all those questions as well.
Dr. Newberg, thank you so much for being here. It's been so fascinating and honestly intellectually stimulating to learn about all these concepts, all the research. I truly, truly hope that your research and your work can reach as many people as possible and impact people both at an individual level and also at a healthcare level. So thank you again.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I hope so. And that's why I love being on programs like yours, because I know we're reaching people and hopefully helping people. But thank you for all the work that you do.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for watching. Hope that resonated with you.
If you're watching on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button and leave your thoughts and comments.
Your support means the world to us and helps us bring these conversations to you for free. We read every single comment and we would love to connect with you there. So go subscribe. Until next time, love yourself, be kind to yourself, and remember, your light is always within you.